In 1829, a fur trapper named David Jackson was making his way through the American West, one of thousands of working men who fanned out across the frontier to hunt and trap and survive off the land. Jackson kept returning to one particular valley in what is now Wyoming. It was a deep, wide valley, completely ringed by mountains, so enclosed, so dramatic that you don't just enter it, you descend into it. His trapping partners, Jedediah Smith and William Sublette, noticed how much time he spent there, and so they named the valley after him. They had a specific word for valleys like this, valleys so deep and so completely swallowed by the mountains around them that it felt like falling into the earth itself. Valleys like that were called a hole, and it became Jackson's Hole, a working man's valley, named by men who went there to work. For the next 150 years or so, that's more or less what it remained, a rugged, remote, spectacular corner of Wyoming. Ranchers and outfitters populated it, and a ski town grew out of it. Jackson Hole continued to be a place where people came to experience something wild and real. But over the last few decades, things began to change. Slowly at first. Working ranchers sold to out-of-state buyers. Luxury lodges replaced old outfitter camps. The wealthy discovered Jackson Hole, and the ultra-wealthy and the private jet set discovered it. Now, Wyoming had never had a state income tax, so word of that got around, and by the time the 21st century rolled around, Jackson Hole had already become one of the most exclusive addresses in America. But then came 2017, and what had been a slow transformation became something else entirely. When Donald Trump signed his tax cuts into law that December, Wyoming became one of the most attractive wealth destinations in the entire country. The new federal rules made it dramatically easier for the ultra-wealthy to shield their assets, to establish trusts, and to relocate their fortunes. Billionaires descended on Teton County, where Jackson Hole sits, the way David Jackson's fellow trappers once descended into the valley itself. But these new men had not come to work the land. They came to own the land. The transformation was as swift as it was staggering, and for the people who had always called this place home, it was devastating. Teton County has become something that economists and sociologists and political scientists are increasingly pointing to as a warning, not just an example of inequality, a preview of it, a window into where this country is heading if nothing changes. The numbers, which I like to dwell on, are almost impossible to comprehend. The top 1% of households in Teton County now earn 221 times more than everyone else who lives there. Not twice as much, not 10 times as much, 221 times as much. The median home price, which means half of all homes sell for more and half sell for less, has surpassed $3 million. What does that look like on the ground in the actual lived human reality of that valley? It looks like this. The people who make that place work, the dishwashers, the landscapers, the lift operators, the hotel housekeepers, many of them cannot afford to live anywhere near the town where they spend their days. Some of them are sleeping in their cars. In Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the richest country on earth. It was named for a working man, by working men, where working men can no longer afford to live. So here's the question I want you to sit with this morning. What if Jackson Hole isn't the exception? What if Jackson Hole is a bellwether for what's coming? Because the same forces that turned one of America's most breathtaking mountain towns into a place where working people cannot survive, those forces are no longer contained to one zip code in Wyoming. They are reshaping this country, all of it, top to bottom. And those forces have a friend in the White House. Nearly half of Americans today don't have enough savings to cover a single $1,000 emergency. In the richest country on earth, millions of families are essentially one car repair away from financial ruin. That's not a talking point. That's current data from Bankrate. Even those who do have an emergency account, the average balance is now about $5,000, roughly half of what it was last year. More than 40% of Americans say they've got no emergency fund at all, none. A third of Americans say they couldn't cover even 1 month of living expenses if they lost their income. A majority, 59%, say their savings would last no more than 3 months. Forget about being a billionaire. Forget about even being a millionaire. In Trump's America, millions of people are lucky, genuinely lucky, if they can count themselves thousandaires. A report just this week found that more Americans than ever are rating their 401k retirement savings, the money they set aside for retirement, for their dignity in old age, just to cover mortgages and everyday bills. Not a lavish vacation, not any kind of splurge. Their mortgage, their groceries, their gas. Here's what makes all of this so striking. It isn't happening in a vacuum. It isn't happening because of bad luck or some unavoidable force of nature. It's happening at the exact same moment that the people at the very top of this economy are accumulating wealth at a pace that would make the robber barons blush. Between 2017, the year of Trump's tax cuts, and 2025, the wealth of America's richest households didn't grow, it exploded. According to a recent New York Times report, the net worth of the top 1% grew by an astonishing 120%. The number of American billionaires jumped by roughly 50%. That's the real divide in Trump's America. It's not red and blue. It's not urban and rural. It's the people sleeping in their cars in Jackson Hole and the people who own the lodges that they can see from the parking lot that they're sleeping in. That gap, that chasm, that's the story of this moment. And this morning, we're going to follow it from one working man's valley in Wyoming all the way to the halls of the United States government. Trump ran as a populist. He stood at rallies across this country. He promised to fight for forgotten Americans, the workers, the veterans, the people who felt left behind. But his signature economic policy, the 2017 tax cuts, delivered its biggest rewards not to those forgotten Americans, but to corporations and the wealthiest households in the country. Those tax cuts helped fuel a stock market surge that minted hundreds of new billionaires. A huge share of those gains flowed upward as corporate taxes were slashed and companies spent billions buying back their own shares. The people who already owned most of those assets, the people who already possessed great wealth, became vastly richer. The people who were already struggling, they're still struggling. In many cases, they're struggling more. Which brings us to the part of the story that goes beyond economics. Because when wealth concentrates this dramatically, when the distance between the top and everyone else becomes this vast, it doesn't just reshape the economy, it begins to reshape power itself. In the last election cycle, for every dollar donated by billionaires to Democrats, $5 went to Republicans. Much of that money came from ultra-wealthy tech and finance figures who aligned themselves with Donald Trump's tax cuts and deregulation agenda. And boy, did Trump deliver for them. At least a dozen billionaires were given roles inside the Trump administration itself. Let that sink in for a moment. Not just donors, not just advisors calling in from the outside. People who appear on the Forbes billionaires list are running federal agencies, shaping federal policy, sitting inside the White House. And it's not just at the federal level. Across this country, billionaires are pouring unprecedented sums into races that most Americans barely know are happening. State attorney general races, county commission seats, increasingly the courts themselves. Take Pennsylvania's recent race for state attorney general. Nearly 90% of the outside money supporting that campaign came from one single billionaire, the richest man in the state, who spent tens of millions of dollars backing his preferred candidate. In Wisconsin, a state Supreme Court election last year became the most expensive judicial race in American history as billionaires from across the country, including notably Elon Musk, flooded the race with millions of dollars. Elections that used to be decided by voters are increasingly becoming contests measured by the billionaires who are bankrolling them. Former Montana governor and Republican National Committee chairman Mark Racicot told the New York Times he remembers a time when wealthy donors hesitated to give too much money to political campaigns. They worried it might look like they were buying influence. How quaint. Roughly 3/4 of Americans want limits on how much money individuals or organizations can spend on political campaigns. More than half of Americans, 53%, say billionaires themselves pose a threat to democracy. Nearly 70% say the ultra-wealthy should play a smaller role in American politics. 71% of Americans support some form of a billionaire tax. And almost everyone, 94% of Americans, agree that the wealth gap in this country is getting wider. That 94% should be 100% because that's not an opinion, it's a fact. Now, I want to be clear about something because this argument gets mischaracterized. Most Americans are not angered by success. This country was built on the idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, on the promise that hard work and ingenuity can take you anywhere. But that ideal